A cowboy's empty belly could kill him faster than a rattlesnake or a rustler's bullet. While Hollywood shows us gunfights and saloon brawls, the real battles of the Wild West were often fought in camp kitchens and around chuck wagons, where creative cooks turned scraps into sustenance and memories into meals. These 40 forgotten Wild West dinners reveal the untold story of how America's frontier was truly won, one spoonful at a time. Chuck Wagon Trail Stew. When the cattle drive stretched endlessly across dusty plains, the chuck wagon cook became the most important person in the outfit. This hearty stew combined whatever meat was available, usually beef, sometimes wild game, with potatoes, onions, and beans. The secret was cooking it low and slow over mesquite coals, letting the flavors blend as the herd moved steadily westward. Cowboys would line up with their tin plates, grateful for anything hot and filling. The stew was thick enough to eat with a spoon, practical for men eating while standing or sitting on rocks. Every cook had their own recipe, passed down through years of feeding hungry cowboys who demanded both quantity and flavor to fuel their demanding work. Cowboy Beans. No meal was more essential to frontier life than a pot of slow-cooked beans. These weren't your ordinary baked beans. They were cooked with salt pork, molasses, and whatever spices the cook could find. The beans would simmer for hours in a heavy iron pot, developing a rich, smoky flavor that could satisfy even the hungriest cowhand. Smart cooks would start a fresh pot every morning, knowing that beans took time to reach perfection. The dish was cheap, filling, and provided the protein needed for long days in the saddle. Cowboys would eat them for breakfast, lunch, and dinner without complaint, often sopping up the thick, flavorful juice with chunks of cornbread or hardtack biscuits. Chili Con Carne. Born from the meeting of Mexican and American frontier cooking, chili con carne was a fiery stew that could warm a cowboy from the inside out. Made with chunks of beef, dried chilies, cumin, and whatever vegetables were on hand, it was a dish that improved with age. Frontier cooks would keep a pot going for days, adding new ingredients as needed. The heat from the chilies helped preserve the meat in an age before refrigeration, while the bold flavors masked any meat that might be past its prime. Different regions developed their own versions, some with beans, others without, but all shared the common goal of creating a satisfying meal that could feed a crowd with minimal ingredients and maximum flavor. Johnny Cakes. These simple cornmeal flatbreads were the frontier's answer to quick bread. Made with just cornmeal, water, and salt, Johnny Cakes could be cooked on a hot griddle or even on a flat rock over the fire. They were portable, long-lasting, and could be eaten hot or cold. Smart travelers would make a batch in the morning and carry them for lunch on the trail. The thick, dense cakes provided steady energy and could be topped with bacon grease, molasses, or wild honey when available. Different regions had their own techniques. Some preferred them thin and crispy, others thick and chewy. The simplicity of the recipe meant anyone could make them, requiring no special skills or fancy ingredients that might be hard to find on the frontier. Dutch oven cornbread. The Dutch oven was the frontier cook's best friend, and cornbread was one of its finest achievements. This wasn't the sweet cornbread we know today. It was dense, hearty, and made with coarse cornmeal that provided real substance. The heavy iron pot with its tight-fitting lid created perfect baking conditions over an open fire. Coals were placed both under and on top of the pot, creating an even heat that produced golden, crusty bread with a tender interior. The cornbread would be cut into wedges and served alongside stews, beans, or eaten plain with butter when it was available. Many cooks would add bacon grease to the batter for extra flavor and calories, creating a bread that could stick to your ribs during long, cold nights. Sourdough bread. Every serious frontier cook maintained a sourdough starter, treating it like a living member of the family. The starter would be carefully tended, fed with flour and water, and protected from temperature extremes. Sourdough bread was more reliable than bread made with commercial yeast, which was often unavailable or too expensive. The tangy flavor of sourdough complemented the simple, hearty foods of frontier life. Bakers would mix the dough in the evening, let it rise overnight, and bake fresh loaves in the morning. The bread stayed fresh longer than regular bread, important when the next supply run might be weeks away. A good sourdough starter could last for years, passed down from cook to cook like a family heirloom. Biscuits and gravy. This hearty combination could fuel a cowboy through the longest day. The biscuits were made with flour, lard, and buttermilk when available, baked until golden in a Dutch oven. The gravy was typically made from sausage drippings, flour, and milk, seasoned with black pepper and salt. When milk wasn't available, cooks would use bacon grease and water, creating a different but equally satisfying gravy. The dish was filling, cheap to make, and used ingredients that kept well on the trail. It provided the carbohydrates and fat needed for hard physical labor. Smart cooks would make extra biscuits that could be eaten cold later or fried up with bacon for another meal. The combination became a staple that spread far beyond the frontier. Dutch oven pot roast. When a cow was too old for the trail or had been injured, it provided the meat for this special meal. The tough cuts of beef were perfect for slow cooking in the heavy Dutch oven. The meat would be seared over high heat, then covered with whatever vegetables were available: potatoes, carrots, onions, and cooked slowly with a small amount of liquid. The long, slow cooking broke down the tough fibers, creating incredibly tender meat that fell apart at the touch of a fork. The vegetables absorbed the rich meat flavors, creating a complete meal in one pot. This was Sunday dinner on the frontier, a special meal that brought the whole outfit together around the fire. The leftovers, if any, would be turned into hash or stew the next day. Cowboy steak. Not all frontier beef was tough and stringy. When a young steer was butchered, the choicest cuts would be cooked simply over hot coals. These steaks were thick, well marbled, and cooked to perfection by men who understood fire and meat. The secret was getting the coals just right, hot enough to sear the outside, but not so hot as to burn the meat before the inside was cooked. Salt and pepper were often the only seasonings needed, letting the flavor of grass-fed beef shine through. Cowboys would gather around the fire, each man cooking his steak to his own preference. It was a rare treat that reminded them of the better meals waiting back home, but also showed them that good food could be found even in the wilderness. Bison, buffalo stew. Before cattle filled the plains, massive herds of buffalo provided meat for Native Americans and early settlers. Buffalo stew was rich, gamey, and incredibly nutritious. The meat was leaner than beef, but more flavorful, requiring careful cooking to prevent it from becoming tough. Smart cooks would combine different cuts, some tender, some tough, to create a stew with varied textures. Wild onions, prairie turnips, and other foraged vegetables would be added when available. The stew was often thickened with cornmeal or ground acorns. This was food that connected the frontier settlers to the land itself, using ingredients that had sustained people on the plains for thousands of years. Each pot told the story of abundance that seemed endless until it suddenly wasn't. Pioneer cabin pumpkin pie. When autumn came to the frontier, pumpkins provided both food and the promise of something sweet. Pioneer women would hollow out pumpkins, fill them with a mixture of eggs, milk, spices, and sweetening, usually molasses or maple syrup rather than sugar. The filled pumpkin would be buried in coals and baked slowly, creating both the pie filling and its own natural crust. The result was rustic but delicious, a taste of home for people far from civilization. Different families had their own spice combinations, using whatever they had brought from back east or could trade for. The pie represented the frontier spirit of making do with what was available while still creating something special for holidays and celebrations. Squirrel and dumplings. Small game was often more reliable than large game, and squirrel provided tender, flavorful meat for frontier families. The squirrels would be cleaned and jointed, then browned in a heavy pot with a little fat. Water or broth would be added, and the meat would simmer until tender. Dumplings made from flour, water, and a little salt would be dropped into the bubbling stew, cooking until fluffy and light. The dish was economical. 1 or 2 squirrels could feed a whole family when stretched with dumplings and vegetables. Hunting squirrels was something children could do, making this a meal that involved the whole family in its preparation. The tender meat and hearty dumplings created a satisfying meal that made the most of whatever the forest provided. Venison grillades and grits. This dish showed the influence of French and Spanish cooking on frontier cuisine. Venison was pounded thin, seasoned, and cooked quickly in a hot skillet, then served over creamy grits. The meat cooked fast, staying tender and flavorful. Grits, made from ground corn, provided a smooth, comforting base that absorbed the meat juices and any simple gravy made in the pan. The combination was filling and used ingredients that were readily available. Corn could be grown or traded for, and deer were plentiful in many areas. The dish required some skill to prepare properly, but the results were worth the effort. It represented the blending of different cultural traditions that happened as people from various backgrounds settled the frontier together. Venison taco soup. This hearty soup combined the abundance of wild game with the spicy flavors learned from Mexican neighbors. Chunks of venison would be browned and combined with beans, corn, tomatoes when available, and plenty of chilies and spices. The soup would simmer for hours, allowing all the flavors to meld together. It was a one-pot meal that could feed a crowd and improved with reheating. The spices helped preserve the meat and added warmth during cold frontier winters. Each cook developed their own blend of seasonings, creating unique versions of the basic recipe. The soup was often served with cornbread or tortillas, making it a complete meal that provided protein, vegetables, and carbohydrates in one satisfying bowl. Dutch oven corn loaf and biscuits. This combination provided both sweet and savory bread options in one cooking session. The corn loaf was made with cornmeal, eggs, and milk, creating a dense, slightly sweet bread that was perfect with beans or stew. The biscuits were more traditional, made with flour and lard, light and flaky when done right. Both were baked in the same Dutch oven, with the corn loaf going in first, since it took longer to cook. The breads would be served warm, often with butter or gravy, providing the carbohydrates needed for hard physical work. Having both options meant there was something for every taste and every meal. The corn loaf could be eaten as a snack or dessert, while the biscuits were perfect for sopping up gravies and stews. Son of a gun stew. This controversial dish used parts of the calf that modern eaters might find challenging: the liver, heart, kidneys, and other organs. These organ meats were incredibly nutritious, and nothing was wasted on the frontier. The organs would be cleaned carefully, cut into small pieces, and cooked with onions and whatever vegetables were available. The result was a rich, intensely flavored stew that provided essential vitamins and minerals often lacking in frontier diets. Cowboys had colorful names for the dish, most too crude for polite company. It was often the first meal prepared when a calf was butchered, using the parts that wouldn't keep well. The stew represented the frontier necessity of using every part of an animal and wasting nothing. Hardtac and sowbelly. This simple combination was the backbone of many frontier meals. Hardtac was a tough, dry biscuit made from flour, water, and salt, baked until it was rock hard. It would keep for months without spoiling, making it perfect for long journeys. Sowbelly was salt pork, usually from the fatty belly of the pig, preserved in salt to prevent spoilage. The pork would be fried until crispy, and the hardtack would be softened in the grease or in coffee. It wasn't fancy, but it provided the calories and protein needed for survival. Smart travelers would pack plenty of both, knowing they could live on this combination for weeks if necessary. The meal represented the basic requirements of frontier life: food that would keep, provide energy, and require minimal preparation. Prairie chicken and dumplings. Prairie chickens were once abundant across the Great Plains, providing fresh meat for frontier families. These birds were smaller than domestic chickens, but had a rich, gamey flavor that was prized by those who knew how to cook them. The birds would be cleaned and jointed, then browned in a heavy pot. Water would be added, and the meat would simmer until tender. Dumplings made from flour and water would be dropped into the bubbling pot, cooking until fluffy. The dish was a special treat, representing successful hunting and the abundance of the prairie. The tender meat and hearty dumplings created a satisfying meal that brought families together. As the prairie chickens became scarce due to hunting and habitat loss, the dish became a memory of better times. Wild rice and rabbit stew. In areas where wild rice grew, it was gathered in late summer and provided a nutritious base for winter meals. Rabbit was plentiful and provided lean, flavorful meat. The rice would be cooked slowly until tender, then combined with pieces of rabbit that had been browned and cooked until falling off the bone. Wild onions, mushrooms, and other foraged vegetables would be added when available. The stew was thick and satisfying, providing complete protein and complex carbohydrates. It represented the connection between frontier settlers and the indigenous peoples who had first discovered these food combinations. The dish required knowledge of the land and its seasons, showing how successful frontier cooking depended on understanding the natural world. Pickled pork and beans. Before refrigeration, pickling was one of the best ways to preserve meat. Pork would be packed in salt and vinegar, creating a tangy preserved meat that would keep for months. When combined with beans, it created a hearty, flavorful meal that could sustain hard-working people. The pickled pork would be rinsed and cut into chunks, then cooked slowly with beans until both were tender. The vinegar from the pork added a sharp, appetizing flavor that cut through the richness of the beans. The dish was economical and practical, using ingredients that could be prepared ahead and stored safely. It represented the ingenuity of frontier cooks who learned to create satisfying meals from preserved ingredients when fresh food wasn't available. Jerky and pemmican. These concentrated foods were the power bars of the frontier, providing maximum nutrition in minimum space. Jerky was made by cutting meat into thin strips and drying it in the sun or over low fires until it was completely dehydrated. Pemmican was even more concentrated, combining ground jerky with rendered fat and sometimes berries. Both foods would keep for months without spoilage and provided the protein and calories needed for long journeys. They could be eaten as is or added to stews and soups to increase their nutritional value. Native Americans had perfected these preservation techniques over thousands of years, and frontier settlers learned to make their own versions. The foods represented the ultimate in portable nutrition, essential for anyone traveling far from settled areas. Ashcake. This simple bread was made when proper cooking equipment wasn't available. Cornmeal would be mixed with water and salt to form a thick dough, then wrapped in large leaves or cloth and buried in hot ashes. The intense, even heat of the ashes would bake the bread slowly, creating a dense, slightly smoky loaf. The bread would be brushed clean of ashes before eating, revealing a golden crust that protected the tender interior. It was emergency food, something that could be made with minimal ingredients and equipment. Travelers who had lost their cooking gear or were traveling light would rely on ashcake for sustenance. The technique was learned from Native Americans and represented the kind of survival knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death on the frontier. Camas root stew. The camas plant was a crucial food source for many Native American tribes and was adopted by some frontier settlers. The bulbs had to be cooked for a very long time to become edible, often buried in pits with hot coals for days. When properly prepared, they were sweet and nutritious, similar to sweet potatoes. The roots would be combined with meat and other vegetables to create a hearty stew. Knowledge of camas was essential for survival in certain regions, but it required expertise to avoid similar-looking plants that were poisonous. The stew represented the importance of learning from indigenous peoples and understanding the resources that the land provided. It was food that connected people directly to the earth and required patience and skill to prepare properly. Bear meat and wild onions. When hunters were lucky enough to bring down a bear, it provided meat for weeks. Bear meat was rich and fatty, requiring careful cooking to make it palatable. The meat would be cut into chunks and cooked slowly with wild onions and whatever other vegetables could be found. The dish was incredibly rich and filling, providing the calories needed for hard physical work. Different parts of the bear required different cooking techniques. Some cuts were tender enough to roast, while others needed long, slow cooking to become edible. The meal was often a celebration, bringing communities together to share in the bounty. It represented both the dangers and rewards of frontier life, where success in hunting could mean the difference between feast and famine. Wild plum dumplings. When wild plums ripened in late summer, frontier cooks would create sweet treats that provided a welcome change from the usual savory fare. The plums would be pitted and combined with a little sugar or honey if available, then wrapped in dumpling dough made from flour and water. The dumplings would be steamed or boiled until the dough was cooked and the fruit had created its own syrup. The result was a rustic dessert that captured the essence of summer in each bite. The dish represented the seasonal nature of frontier eating and the importance of making the most of nature's bounty when it was available. It was often served at celebrations and gatherings, bringing sweetness to the hard life of the frontier. Buffalo tongue. Considered a delicacy by those who knew how to prepare it, buffalo tongue was tender, flavorful, and highly prized. The tongue would be cleaned carefully, then either roasted over coals or boiled until tender. When cooked properly, it was more tender than most other cuts of meat and had a rich, unique flavor. The dish was often reserved for special occasions or important guests. It required skill to prepare correctly and represented the kind of nose-to-tail eating that was necessary on the frontier. Nothing was wasted when an animal was killed, and the tongue was one of the choice portions. The meal connected frontier settlers to the great herds that once covered the plains, and to the indigenous hunters who had perfected techniques for using every part of the buffalo. BBQ biscuit pie. This ingenious dish combined two frontier favorites into one satisfying meal. Leftover barbecued meat would be chopped and mixed with gravy, then layered in a Dutch oven with biscuit dough on top and bottom. The pie would bake slowly over coals, creating a golden crust that sealed in the savory filling. The bottom biscuit layer absorbed the meat juices while staying firm enough to hold everything together. It was a way to stretch expensive meat into a meal that could feed more people. Ranch cooks would make this when they had tough cuts of beef that needed long, slow cooking to become tender. The dish represented frontier ingenuity, taking simple ingredients and transforming them into something greater than the sum of their parts. Vanic frying pan bread. This quick bread was a lifesaver for travelers who needed fresh bread but didn't have time for rising or elaborate preparation. Made with flour, baking powder, salt, and whatever fat was available, the dough would be patted flat and cooked in a greased skillet over the fire. The bread would be thick and dense, with a crispy crust and tender interior. Smart cooks would make it in the morning and carry pieces for lunch on the trail. The bread was filling and provided steady energy for long days of hard work. Different regions had their own variations. Some added cornmeal for texture, others included bits of bacon or dried fruit when available. The simplicity of bannock made it popular with everyone who needed reliable bread without fuss. Barbecued ribs. Long before backyard barbecues, frontier cooks were slow cooking ribs over wood fires to create tender, flavorful meat. The ribs would be seasoned with salt, pepper, and whatever spices were available, then cooked slowly over low coals for hours. The key was maintaining steady, low heat and turning the ribs regularly to prevent burning. Some cooks would baste the meat with its own drippings or a simple mixture of vinegar and spices. The long cooking time broke down the tough connective tissue, creating ribs that fell off the bone. This was special occasion food, prepared when there was time and enough meat to make it worthwhile. The dish brought people together around the fire, creating a sense of community and celebration in the harsh frontier environment. Corn fritters. These crispy golden treats provided a welcome change from regular cornbread. Fresh corn kernels would be cut from the cob and mixed with flour, eggs, and milk to create a thick batter. The mixture would be dropped by spoonfuls into hot fat and fried until golden brown and crispy. The fritters were sweet from the corn, but hearty enough to serve as a side dish with meat and beans. They could be eaten hot from the pan or saved for later meals. When fresh corn wasn't available, dried corn that had been soaked and ground could be substituted. The fritters represented the frontier cook's ability to take a simple ingredient like corn and transform it into something special that brought joy to the dinner table. Dakota fried tomatoes. When the garden was producing more tomatoes than could be eaten fresh, frontier cooks would slice and fry them to create a different side dish. Green or red tomatoes would be sliced thick, dipped in cornmeal or flour, and fried in bacon grease until golden and crispy. The coating protected the tomatoes from the hot fat while adding texture and flavor. The dish was tangy and satisfying, providing vegetables when fresh produce was scarce. Different cooks had their own techniques. Some preferred green tomatoes for their firmness, others liked the sweetness of ripe red ones. The fried tomatoes were often served alongside meat and beans, adding color and variety to frontier meals. They represented the seasonal nature of frontier eating and the innovation required to preserve and use garden produce. Cowboy goulash. This hearty one-pot meal combined whatever meat and vegetables were available into a satisfying stew. Ground beef or chunks of tougher cuts would be browned with onions, then combined with tomatoes, beans, and pasta if it was available. The dish would simmer slowly, allowing all the flavors to blend together. It was economical cooking at its finest, stretching meat with vegetables and starches to feed more people. Each cook developed their own version based on what ingredients were on hand. The goulash could be made ahead and reheated, improving in flavor with time. It represented the international influences on frontier cooking as immigrants brought their traditional recipes and adapted them to available ingredients and cooking conditions. Green chili stew. This spicy stew was born from the meeting of Mexican and American frontier cooking traditions. Chunks of pork or beef would be browned and combined with roasted green chilies, onions, and potatoes. The stew would simmer slowly until the meat was tender and the flavors had melded together. The heat from the chilies provided warmth during cold frontier winters and helped preserve the meat. Different regions had their own variations. Some preferred mild chilies, others wanted fire-breathing heat. The stew was often served with tortillas or cornbread to help cool the palate. It represented the cultural exchange that happened as different groups of people settled the frontier together, sharing recipes and techniques that created new regional cuisines. Pioneer bean pot. This slow-cooked dish was the ultimate in set-it-and-forget-it frontier cooking. Navy beans would be soaked overnight, then layered in a heavy pot with salt pork, onions, molasses, and spices. The pot would be buried in coals and left to cook all day, emerging with tender beans in a rich, flavorful sauce. The long, slow cooking allowed all the flavors to meld together while the beans absorbed the smoky taste from the salt pork. It was economical cooking that could feed a large group with minimal attention from the cook. The dish improved with reheating and could last for several meals. It represented the patience and planning required for successful frontier cooking, where good food took time but was worth the wait. Wojapi. This sacred berry sauce holds the title as one of the most important foods in Lakota culture. Wojapi isn't just a sauce, it's liquid tradition passed down through generations of native mothers and grandmothers. The word itself means pudding in Lakota, but calling it pudding doesn't do justice to its deep cultural meaning. Making wojapi requires patience and respect for the ingredients. You start with whatever berries nature provides: chokecherries, blueberries, or strawberries, work best. The berries get crushed and mixed with water, then slowly cooked until they release their natural sugars. Some tribes add a touch of honey or maple syrup, but traditional wojapi relies on the fruit's own sweetness. The magic happens during the slow cooking process. As the berries break down, they create a thick, rich sauce that coats the back of a spoon. This isn't meant to be eaten alone. Wojapi serves as a companion to frybread, wild game, or even modern dishes like pancakes. The Lakota people consider wojapi essential for ceremonies and gatherings where sharing food strengthens community bonds. Tanka Bars. Tanka Bars represent the modern evolution of pemmican, created by Native American entrepreneur Mark Tilson. These bars combine traditional buffalo meat with cranberries and natural seasonings, bringing ancient nutrition into the modern world. The name Tanka means great or large in Lakota, reflecting the big impact these small bars have on both nutrition and Native American economic development. Unlike mass-produced energy bars filled with artificial ingredients, Tanka bars stick to the original pemmican recipe principles. Buffalo meat provides the protein base, while cranberries add natural sweetness and antioxidants. The bars contain no preservatives, yet they stay fresh for months because the traditional drying and fat rendering process naturally prevents spoilage. What makes Tanka bars special goes beyond nutrition. They represent economic sovereignty for Native American communities. The buffalo meat comes from Native-owned ranches, and the profits support tribal economic development. When you eat a Tanka bar, you're not just getting healthy food, you're supporting Native American communities working to rebuild their traditional food systems while creating modern businesses. Acorn Bread. Acorns covered the ground every fall like nature's own grocery store, and Native American tribes across North America knew how to turn these bitter nuts into sweet, nutritious bread. The process requires patience and knowledge passed down through generations, because raw acorns contain tannins that make them inedible without proper preparation. The first step involves cracking open the acorns and grinding them into meal using stones. This acorn meal tastes incredibly bitter due to the tannins, so it needs to be leached with water. Traditional methods involved placing the meal in baskets and pouring water through it repeatedly until the bitter taste disappeared. Some tribes buried the meal in stream beds, letting running water do the work over several days. Once the tannins are removed, the acorn meal becomes sweet and nutty. It gets mixed with water to form dough, then shaped into flat cakes and cooked on hot stones or in earth ovens. The finished bread has a dense texture and rich flavor that's completely different from wheat bread. Acorn bread provided essential calories and nutrients during winter months when other food sources became scarce. Wild rice and cranberry pilaf. Wild rice isn't actually rice. It's a grass seed that grows in the shallow lakes of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and southern Canada. The Ojibwe people call it manuman, which means good berry, and they've harvested it using traditional canoes and wooden poles for over 1,000 years. This sacred food holds such importance that the Ojibwe have prophecies about following the food that grows on water to their promised land. Harvesting wild rice requires skill and respect for the plant. Families paddle wooden canoes into rice beds during the late summer, using carved poles to bend the rice stalks over the canoe while knocking the ripe seeds into the boat with wooden paddles. The seeds get parched over fires, then winnowed to remove the hulls, creating the dark, nutty grains we know as wild rice. Cooking wild rice and cranberry pilaf combines the earthy flavor of manuman with the tartness of cranberries, another traditional food source. The rice gets simmered slowly until the grains split open and become tender, then mixed with dried cranberries, wild onions, and sometimes nuts like hazelnuts or walnuts. This dish provides complete nutrition with protein, complex carbohydrates, antioxidants, and healthy fats all in one bowl. Bison bone broth. Long before bone broth became a trendy health food, Native American tribes were simmering bison bones for days to extract every bit of nutrition from these massive animals. Bison bone broth provided essential nutrients during harsh winters when fresh food became scarce. The cooking process extracted collagen, minerals, and marrow from the bones, creating a rich, healing broth that could sustain entire families. Making traditional bison bone broth requires patience and planning. Large leg bones and knuckle bones stones get cracked open to expose the marrow, then placed in skin-lined pits with hot stones and water. The cooking process takes 24 to 48 hours, with fresh hot stones added regularly to maintain the simmering temperature. Some tribes added wild vegetables like prairie turnips or lamb's quarters for extra nutrition and flavor. The finished broth has a rich, golden color and gelatin-like consistency when it cools. This natural gelatin helps heal gut problems and joint pain, while the minerals strengthen bones and teeth. Modern research has confirmed what Native Americans knew instinctively. Bone broth provides nutrients that are almost impossible to get from other sources, including glycine, proline, and hydroxyproline that support healthy skin, hair, and nails. Bear fat fry bread. Fry bread carries complicated emotions in Native American communities. While it represents survival and adaptability, it also reminds people of government commodities and forced changes to traditional diets. Bear fat fry bread connects to older traditions when native hunters rendered fat from bears, elk, and buffalo to create cooking oil that could last for months without refrigeration. Bear fat has unique properties that make it perfect for frying. It has a high smoke point, so it doesn't burn easily, and it adds a rich, nutty flavor to whatever gets cooked in it. Rendering bear fat requires cutting the fat into small pieces and slowly heating it until the pure oil separates from the solid pieces. The rendered fat gets stored in hide containers or modern jars, staying fresh for months. The fry bread dough itself is simple, just flour, salt, baking powder, and water mixed into a soft dough. Small pieces get stretched thin and dropped into hot bear fat, where they puff up into golden circles with crispy edges and soft centers. Traditional fry bread was smaller and denser than modern versions, designed to provide maximum calories with minimal ingredients. Eaten with wojapi, honey, or meat, bear fat fry bread provided essential calories during long hunts or harsh weather. Homony Stew. Hominy represents one of humanity's greatest food innovations, though most people don't realize its importance. The process of treating corn with alkali solutions to create hominy makes the grain more nutritious and easier to digest, preventing diseases like pellagra that plagued populations who ate untreated corn. Native American tribes developed this technique independently, calling the processed corn by various names, including nixtamal and hominy. Creating hominy starts with dried field corn kernels and wood ash from specific trees like hickory or oak. The ash gets mixed with water to create lye, which is then heated with the corn kernels until the tough outer hulls loosen and can be rubbed off. What remains are plump white kernels with a distinctive chewy texture and nutty flavor that's completely different from regular corn. Homony stew combines these processed corn kernels with meat, usually venison or rabbit, and whatever vegetables are in season. Wild onions, sunflower seeds, and berries often find their way into the pot, creating a hearty one-dish meal that could feed large groups. The stew gets cooked slowly over low fires, allowing the flavors to develop and the hominy to become tender. This wasn't just sustenance, it was complete nutrition that could sustain people through the hardest times. Cedar tea. Cedar tea doesn't actually come from cedar trees. It's made from various evergreen trees, including white pine, hemlock, and juniper, that Native Americans called cedar because of their similar properties. This aromatic tea provided essential vitamin C during winter months when fresh fruits and vegetables weren't available, preventing scurvy and other nutritional diseases that affected many early European explorers. Different tribes used different trees for their cedar tea, but the preparation method remained similar across cultures. Fresh or dried needles get steeped in hot water for several minutes, creating a tea with a piney, slightly bitter flavor. The tea contains not only vitamin C, but also antimicrobial compounds that help fight infections and respiratory problems common during cold weather. Drinking cedar tea connects people to the forest in a direct, intimate way. Each sip carries the essence of ancient trees that have weathered countless seasons. Many Native Americans consider cedar tea sacred, using it in ceremonies and healing rituals as well as daily nutrition. The tea varies in strength and flavor depending on which tree species is used and what time of year the needles are harvested, with spring growth offering the mildest flavor.